ours. Like,
Oh my god. So
Oh no.
I signed our made agreement under your door.
Yeah, that's
today,
what I was
but it came to our door this past month.
oh my god, I actually want to get slapped.
I came to the back of our door for the past month.
Yes, more effort.
They like filled it out right away.
Yeah, it was 3 in the morning when I was that way.
All right, we are ready to continue talking about our nervous system and specifically our autonomic nervous system. We're going to recap in drawing form real quick what we did last time. All right, so we were talking about our overall view of our nervous system. So we know we have a central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord, and we have a peripheral nervous system, our PNS, out in the rest of the body. Okay. So we talked about the fact that we need nerves going from receptors out in the periphery up to our central nervous system, to our brain and spinal cord. So those were our afferent nerves. Okay. So afferent nerves go to, that's big, okay, great. All right, so afferent nerves going from the periphery to the central nervous system. We also have nerves that then come out of the central nervous system and go into the periphery. So these were our efferent nerves, efferent going out. We also sometimes refer to these as motor nerves, and here's where we have another split. So we're going to have a split here. We're going out from our central nervous system to our periphery. Things that go to skeletal muscle, so to voluntary muscle. That's the somatic division. So these are somatic nerves. That goes to like our named muscles from lab, so skeletal muscle. What we're talking about, the other side of this equation, which are our autonomic nerves. So our autonomic nervous system is here. And here's where we're dividing into our sympathetics and our parasympathetics. Where's our sympathetics? Both of those then are going to the same effector organs, but in different ways. So they have different pathways and they have different effects when they get to things like our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle. This is just a redrawing of our Big Mac. Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. That's the big picture. Where we're located for today is in that parasympathetic and sympathetic portion of our autonomic nervous system. It's part of our efferent or motor division of our nervous system. Other things we talked about are where these nerves are physically coming from. So we know that in addition to
that. If not, I'll pick a different recording for you all. Okay. Still drawing. Okay. So we know that if we're talking about our person, right? So a person, we got a head, we got some arms, a body, some legs. Here's my gingerbread person. right? Our sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation is coming from different places, right? So sympathetics are coming from our thoracolumbar region. Okay, so our thorax to our lower back. Okay, sympathetics. And our parasympathetics are coming from the craniosacral region. So that's our cranial nerves and some stuff coming out of our sacrum. And those are our parasympathetic origins. So questions about this at this point? This is basically where we're at for today. Cool. So I'm practicing these drawings for you as partially as a study tool. A way you can practice studying for this course is also coming up with some drawings that really summarize some of our concepts. And then you could draw them directly on your scratch paper at the beginning of the exam. You'll have handy dandy notes right in front of you. Okay. So we also talked in more detail about the specific routes, so like the course these nerves will take to get to those effector organs. So we talked about different ways that sympathetic nerves and parasympathetic nerves get out to those effector organs, right? So when we are thinking about that, we're going to think about what's our most common arrangement for our sympathetic nerves when they're going out to those effector organs. You can take another couple seconds. Okay. So we got some confusion going on here. So let's talk about that. All right. So sympathetic chain part is right? So when we're talking about going out to an effector organ, in general, we're thinking about a single preganglionic neuron. So preganglionic is first. Preganglionic. Neuron. Then we have a synapse in a ganglion. So if we're thinking about our sympathetic nervous system, that synapse is usually specifically in our sympathetic chain, which is a chain of ganglia that lies parallel to the spinal column. Okay. So this part is specifically for those sympathetic nerves, is that sympathetic chain. Okay. Then we're going to go post ganglionic nerve. To our effector organ. So for our effector, I'm just going to draw an example, a heart. I like the heart as an example. Effector. So we talked about 3 ways that the sympathetic nerves can get to where they're going. This one's the most common one. So you really only have the 2 nerves you have to think about. So we don't have another ganglion near the effector organ. We just go directly to the organ itself. So otherwise, this first answer is correct. You just have an extra step written up there. So most common way for a sympathetic nerve, preganglionic to that sympathetic chain, then out the spinal nerve as our postganglionic nerve going to the organ. We also talked about the fact that some sympathetic nerves go to the adrenal medulla, to those modified postganglionic nerves we call chromaffin cells. And some sympathetic nerves have a longer preganglionic neuron that goes out to collateral ganglion and then goes to an effector organ. But those are 3 different routes. You wouldn't have one nerve doing all 3 of those. Okay. So I heard some chatter, which is fine, but does that mean there are questions or are there points of confusion right now? Okay, cool. I assume you were just discussing that. Okay. So now we're going to start talking about the chemicals involved here. Okay. So when we talk about our nerves and our neurons, what's going on in those synapses when they talk to each other is we're releasing neurotransmitters. Okay. So when we talked about neurons in the brain and how neurons work overall, we just mentioned that there are a bunch of neurotransmitters, and we mentioned GABA and glutamate as 2 examples. But now that we're in the autonomic nervous system, we're going to be thinking about some really specific neurotransmitters, and we're going to learn where they are and how the receptors for those specific neurotransmitters operate. And so in total, we're going to be thinking about acetylcholine, abbreviation ACH. We're going to be thinking about norepinephrine, which we can also think of as a hormone because it's going to go affect out in the body. And so sometimes we'll see that as NE, I think it is in some of your tables. We'll also be talking about epinephrine kind of involved in this process, coming mostly from our adrenal medulla. Okay, so those are the 3 that we're really going to be sorting through when we're thinking about the autonomic nervous system, and then actually also the somatic nervous system. Okay. So when we're thinking about these neurotransmitters, right, we have a neurotransmitter released from that axon terminal of our preganglionic nerve, right? So we've seen something like this when we were doing synapses, right? So we had those little baggies of neurotransmitter. We know that when the action potential comes down that axon, gets to the axon terminal, that change in membrane potential allows the voltage-gated calcium channel to open, triggering the docking and then release of those neurotransmitters. They get into the synapse. And then on the opposite side, right, we have our next neuron receiving that signal at the receptors. Okay. So here we'd have a receptor, right, that would bind a neurotransmitter. And then we have a reaction in that second cell, in that second neuron. Okay. So what we're talking about when we're talking about these different types of receptors in this unit is we're looking in at those receptors first on the postganglionic cell. So we're going to talk about the preganglionic nerve, talking to the postganglionic nerve, and we'll think about the neurotransmitters involved there and then being received by that postganglionic nerve. And then we'll also look at the effector organ side. So the postganglionic neuron itself will release neurotransmitters, which will then be received by receptors on our effector organs. Okay. So when we talk about these different types of receptors, they have different names based on the neurotransmitter that they're receiving. Okay, so our classes of receptors here, we're going to have cholinergic receptors. So note this chol part here. Cholinergic receptors are receiving acetylcholine, right? So if you see that word cholinergic, that's referring to the fact that we're talking about a synapse, a ganglion, an effector organ that is being controlled by the release of acetylcholine. Adrenergic receptors, unfortunately, are not the same as the word norepinephrine, but adrenergic, think adrenal glands and adrenaline. Okay, so if you're trying to remember that, tie that in right now with your understanding that the sympathetic nervous system is going to that adrenal medulla. So we're really going to see these adrenergic receptors when we're thinking about the sympathetic portion of our autonomic nervous system. Right. So when we're talking about these neurotransmitters, we got them in different places. We got different types. Okay. So I'm going to draw first a preganglionic nerve, and then we'll have our postganglionic nerve, some little feet, some axon terminals here, and then we're going to have our effector organ. Okay, so we're thinking here and here when we're thinking about those neurotransmitters. Okay, so also, okay, get to that in a second. All right. So when we're thinking about the preganglionic neurons, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic, that preganglionic neuron is always going to be releasing acetylcholine, right? So you're going to have acetylcholine here in that ganglion between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. Okay? So that's for both parts of our autonomic nervous system. But when we think about the synapse, the connection, the junction between our postganglionic neuron and its effector organ, here's where we're going to have a difference. Okay, so I'm now going to label this. Specifically, let's think about this as parasympathetic. Okay. So if we're thinking about a parasympathetic connection, then that junction between our postganglionic neuron and the effector organ is again going to be acetylcholine. Okay, so we see that twice if we're thinking about parasympathetics. Okay. But if we're thinking about the sympathetic nervous system, we've got something different. So we're still going to have acetylcholine being released by that preganglionic neuron. Okay. But when we look at that postganglionic neuron, we'll also reach it up to the heart here. Why not? Okay. Pretend that's touching. Okay. We'll have acetylcholine here. When we're touching that effector organ, we're now mainly going to have norepinephrine being released. Okay. The caveat here is that the adrenal medulla, that inside of the adrenal gland, counts as part of our sympathetic nervous system. So the other thing we may want to include in that route is the epinephrine as well. So that adrenal medulla, in addition to norepinephrine, also releases epinephrine. So we'll just give that an E for now. Okay. So these are where all these neurotransmitters are in terms of the body, these pathways. So when we think about receptors for our different parts of the nervous system, on effector organs and on nerves, we need to think about what neurotransmitter is being released in that location. So this is a big picture kind of route broken down by kind of pathway. So here we can see The autonomic nervous system, we're looking at sympathetics here, right? So these are our three roots for the sympathetic nervous system. So when we're looking at those preganglionic neurons, okay, since they're preganglionic, coming from the central nervous system out into the peripheral nervous system, right? We don't have to worry about what type they are because they're all releasing acetylcholine. Okay? So whether they go to the sympathetic chain, whether they're going out to the medulla of the adrenal gland, right? Still coming from there, right? Acetylcholine again. Whether they're going out to collateral ganglia, again, acetylcholine, right? So sympathetic nervous system, always acetylcholine in that synapse between the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, okay? And that'll stay the same for our parasympathetics. But between the roots at the end, we're going to see that the ones that just involve normal old postganglionic neurons are releasing primarily norepinephrine, whether they're going to the sympathetic chain or whether they're going to collateral ganglia. But if we're thinking about the adrenal medulla, we're mainly thinking about epinephrine. Okay. So this is going to affect what type of receptors we see in these locations. We'll talk in detail about receptors, but you're going to notice at this ganglion, right, where we're releasing acetylcholine, we have our cholinergic receptor, okay? Choline, cholinergic receptor, right? When we have norepinephrine or epinephrine, we're thinking adrenergic receptors. Okay? This is another adrenergic receptor, that's another adrenergic receptor. In the parasympathetic nervous system, we just have the one pathway that we're interested in. So preganglionic neuron we'll refer to as cholinergic because it's releasing acetylcholine, right? So the preganglionic neuron is cholinergic because that's what it transmits, right? Postganglionic neuron here is also cholinergic because again, it's releasing acetylcholine, okay? Then we again have a cholinergic receptor on our effector organ, okay? For the sympathetics, you would have seen this postganglionic neuron referred to as adrenergic because it releases epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, or norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. So same naming system as for the receptor for that neurotransmitter. Yeah. So we're going to have a couple questions just on that stuff. So pull up the slide that has the big summary of where these neurotransmitters are. So we're just going to walk through understanding what's being released, what's being received. Okay. Okay, I'll pop through those questions pretty quick. So starting, take a couple seconds to review. We're talking about a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron. What neurotransmitter is that going to release? Great. Yes, acetylcholine is going to be true for preganglionic neurons for both our parasympathetic and sympathetics. Okay. So in that case, what neurotransmitter does a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron receive with its receptors? Okay, great. Preganglionic neuron released acetylcholine. So the postganglionic neuron has to receive acetylcholine with its receptors. So that's just one-to-one. We're talking about that same physical space. Now let's think about the sympathetics. So what were those preganglionic neurons releasing? Preganglionic neuron, it's still acetylcholine. So sympathetic, parasympathetic, doesn't matter. Preganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine. Okay. So in that case, following that same flow of logic, what would a postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system be receiving? So what is it going to need receptors for on the soma or dendrites in that ganglion? Okay. This is still acetylcholine. So this is trying to get to for us right here, right? Acetylcholine is all over the place. We see it over and over and over in most of the locations. We will think about epinephrine and norepinephrine and the adrenergic receptors in detail. But if you're just going for guessing what neurotransmitter is being released at a synapse or a ganglion, you should guess acetylcholine unless you know very specifically that it's epinephrine or norepinephrine, because we only see that epinephrine and norepinephrine in one very specific place, which is being released by the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the only place we see these two middle ones is going to be when we're releasing from those sympathetic postganglionic neurons. Okay, cool. We got a bunch of people, got 4 out of 4. Okay, so acetylcholine is all over the place, which means that we're going to have a bunch of receptors for acetylcholine. Those are our cholinergic receptors. Okay. Our cholinergic receptors come in 2 flavors. They're all receiving that acetylcholine, right? So we're always going to have acetylcholine binding onto that receptor, okay? But the receptors are going to be of different types in terms of their function, okay? So a nicotinic cholinergic receptor is going to operate pretty fast. What a nicotinic cholinergic receptor does is it just causes a cation channel to open. Right, so cations are positive ions. So think like sodium, right? Calcium, cations, right? So when we open cation channels, I picked sodium and calcium specifically because both sodium and calcium want to flow into cells when we're talking about their electrochemical driving forces. All right, so what happens when a nicotinic cholinergic receptor encounters acetylcholine? So it opens cation channels that usually result in depolarization. So nicotinic cholinergic receptors, we're going to see very commonly in those ganglia, in those synapses between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. Okay. And the reason for that is that what we want to do is create an action potential in that postganglionic neuron, right? We want to send the signal on down. Okay. So if we want to send the signal on down, we have to cause a depolarization to threshold in that postganglionic neuron. We're going to do that by opening cation channels. Probably we're letting things like sodium in, right? So that we can have a new action potential. So those cholinergic receptors work pretty quickly. Happens when that preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. The muscarinic cholinergic receptors operate a little more slowly. We're more often going to see these at our effector organs for the parasympathetic nervous system. So unlike the sympathetics, the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, they just release acetylcholine, right? No adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? Just acetylcholine all the way through for parasympathetics. But when we get to that effector organ, we might want a more complicated response than just creating an action potential in the muscle, right? We might want to do something more complex than that. So our muscarinic cholinergic receptors are G protein coupled. Their effect can depend on that target. So we might think of, didn't think I had something after that red column, but maybe I do. So those nicotinic cholinergic receptors are basically like our ionotropic receptors in our previous unit. Ionotropic, gotta sound it out. Okay. So we talked about those as our ligand gated channels sometimes, right? Our ionotropic receptors are just receiving a neurotransmitter, opening our ion channels. Our muscarinic cholinergic receptors are going to be more closely associated with our metabotropic receptors. Metabotropic. Okay. All right. So when we saw that word before, those were the ones where we have that G protein coming in, or that G protein dissociating on the inside of the cell, scuttling over to the side, triggering some second messenger system, more complicated effects. Okay, so we can still have that even though this is acetylcholine. So those cholinergic receptors, we find them in the ganglia of our autonomic nervous system, right? So we're going to see on those pictures we just looked there, I didn't underline it, right? But in those ganglia, where we have the synapse between our preganglionic and postganglionic, we had nicotinic cholinergic receptors on that postganglionic neuron. On our effector organs for the parasympathetic specifically, we're going to have cholinergic receptors, but they're going to be muscarinic. So we can have more complicated, longer lasting responses. Okay. When we get to the somatic nervous system, we're going to see that those types of nerves as well are releasing acetylcholine, right? So that's not part of our autonomic nervous system, but we still see acetylcholine there. So we still have cholinergic receptors. Those ones are going to be nicotinic because the way that we contract a skeletal muscle is by creating a depolarization. So skeletal muscle essentially has its own kind of action potential thing going on in the skeletal muscle. So that's how we're going to see that we contract skeletal muscle. So we still want those kind of fast acting, kind of simple nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Okay. Sweat glands are special and an exception, and we are not going to talk about them beyond having them on this slide so that you know that there are exceptions. But the sweat glands are the only effector organs from the sympathetic nervous system that would be able to respond to acetylcholine. So that's much more complicated, but those ones would also have muscarinic cholinergic receptors. So we're doing big picture stuff though. Okay. So might be able to answer a question like, which part of the nervous system is innervating the adrenal medulla? And then which neurotransmitter is going to get released from the adrenal medulla? This is leading us into our next topic. Okay, take another couple seconds and then we'll go over the answer. Seeing many new answers coming in. Okay, let's take a look anyway. All right, cool. So for those of you who answered, you are on the right track, mostly, at least half of us. Okay, so when we're thinking about that sympathetic nervous system, one of those alternate routes, not in the sympathetic ganglion, was we had our preganglionic neuron, right, going to the adrenal medulla. Right, so I'm going to draw a weird little triangle here, right? And then we had those chromaffin cells here. So I'm going to write a C for that, for chromaffin in the adrenal medulla, okay? And those chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla, they're part of the sympathetic nervous system. They release mostly epinephrine, so 80% epinephrine, but they do also release about 20% norepinephrine, a little bit of dopamine. Okay, so we're mainly going to be focusing on that epinephrine is coming from the adrenal medulla. So that leads us into our adrenergic receptors that are receiving epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so like to associate that, right, with our adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney, right? So adrenergic, think like adrenaline. We did this before, right? Adrenaline equals epinephrine. Same thing. So adrenergic receptors receive that epinephrine. And then we've got lots of different types of receptors that can respond to that epinephrine or norepinephrine coming from those other sympathetic nerves. Okay. So there are two big groups of adrenergic receptors. We've got our alpha receptors. We got two of them. And we're basically getting towards walking through that table I recommended you take a quick look at before class today. So we're going to have alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. And then we're going to have beta receptors. We have three types of beta receptors. All of them are coupled to G proteins. So we would think of all of them as being metabotropic. Basically, we don't have any ionotropic receptors here. So we're going to expect to see more complex internal cellular responses than when we were thinking about like the nicotinic cholinergic receptors specifically. So if we describe something as being G protein coupled, we might have an adrenergic receptor, or we might have a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. Now we're going to dive into alpha versus beta and the different types. I'm going to walk you through just what you're looking at here, right? So hopefully you took a glance at this, but here we have a breakdown between all of these are adrenergic receptors, right? So we've got alpha, and beta for 5 total receptor types. We have examples of the effector organs. So we will talk more about those when we get to those organ systems. We're going to be doing our final unit on cardiac muscle. So we'll think about the fact that it has those beta-1 adrenergic receptors at that point. We'll talk about what's going on in our blood vessels and their receptor types in A&P2. But we don't need to necessarily memorize that for right now. What we do want to know is what neurotransmitter they're responding to. Right? So you're going to see they're all responding to norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? But they have preferences sometimes. So our alpha receptors of both types prefer norepinephrine to epinephrine. When we're thinking about beta receptors, either they don't care. So beta-1 and beta-3 receptors equally react to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Beta-2 receptors are the only type of receptor that highly, highly, highly prefers epinephrine to norepinephrine. Okay? So if your adrenal glands are producing a bunch of epinephrine, beta-2 receptors are going to eat that up as soon as it's present. Okay? And we will see that happening when we think about stress responses eventually. When we're trying to tease out what type we're looking at, we're also going to think about those second messengers inside the cell a little bit. So you can see this camp here everywhere. So that's cyclic AMP. So that's a very common second messenger molecule inside cells. Right? So we see that all over the place. We also see this additional molecule IP3. Okay? You're going to notice that all of our beta receptors are activating cyclic AMP, while our alpha receptors do other stuff. So we do see cyclic AMP involved with the alpha-2 receptor, but it's inhibiting cyclic AMP production. So it's like turning off that signal. And then alpha-1 receptors don't have anything to do with cyclic AMP at all. When we get to the effector organs, we can have different effects. So we can have excitation. So think kind of causing depolarization, causing cations to move in, or we can have inhibition, the opposite, if we're thinking about those beta-2 receptors. But those are generalizations. So really right now we're thinking about neurotransmitters and those signal transduction mechanisms primarily. Okay. So when we think about their properties, now written out in words, but I do recommend that table gives you a lot of bang for your buck. So if you're memorizing anything, parts of that table might be a thing to just kind of fill in and copy over a bunch of times. Okay, which is why I walked you through. Adrenergic receptors, alpha receptors, we are going to see in the sympathetic nervous system, in the effector organs. That's really where all of our adrenergic receptors are going to be located. Alpha receptors are our most common type. So there are more beta receptors in terms of we got 1, 2, 3, but there are more alpha receptors in terms of if you were to place pins throughout your body and go look for what receptors there are. Usually they're excitatory, so usually they're going to cause the cell to do something. They're going to cause excitation. And they always prefer norepinephrine to epinephrine, right? So we can see for our alpha receptor, you can see norepinephrine and epinephrine, or that square here. They bind into this G protein coupled receptor. G protein dissociates. And here we can see, now we're looking specifically at an alpha-1 receptor because what we're doing is triggering the creation of this IP3, which then does stuff in our cell. And specifically, we can see some stuff with calcium going on. Beta adrenergic receptors work differently. Okay. So we have varied affinity for norepinephrine and epinephrine for 2 of our types, right? 1 and 3. We have equal responsiveness to epinephrine and norepinephrine. For those beta-2 receptors, they highly, highly preferred the epinephrine. We can tell that we have one either because of those affinities or because they're activating that cyclic A&P as their second messenger. So when you're looking at this picture, thing to be careful about is this minus versus plus sign right here, because we have two different receptor types, right? So on the left, we just have another alpha receptor. So this is an alpha 2 receptor, right? So it would be still triggering that dissociation of the G protein, but it's inhibiting that minus sign, right? Inhibiting the cyclic A&P production. So it would be like turning the signal off. But when we're looking at a beta receptor on the other side, that beta receptor is activating the cyclic A&P. So beta receptor is going to produce more of that cyclic A&P inside the cell. So we have basically 4 types of receptors being depicted on here. So all of that summarized in this table here, just that table again. Written out, beta 1 adrenergic receptors, it's just copied down essentially from that table, located in our cardiac muscle and kidneys, excitatory, equal affinity for norepinephrine and epinephrine. Second one down the list, beta 2 adrenergic receptors. We could see in that table that they're in some of our blood vessels and smooth muscle. They're usually inhibitory, so that's a special kind of property there of those beta 2 receptors. Our other special property is that they really, really like epinephrine coming from those adrenal glands, so that greater affinity. Beta 3 adrenergic receptors, see them mainly in fat and adipose tissue, usually excitatory. They've again got equal affinity for norepinephrine and epinephrine. All 3 of those beta receptors are activating the cyclic A&P. Okay, so we'll stop there. That is all of the receptors for our autonomic nervous system. So we'll move on from there next time.